This video is brought to you by RV 360 Solutions, where we're bringing the RV industry full circle by providing inspections, consulting, and training. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the black tank flush system that we find on most new RVs now, and just some of the common misconceptions, misperceptions, and things that you should make sure that you do. So the biggest thing is when you're connecting this, so let me back up and just say that for those of you who may have noticed, this is actually a city water connection that I had. City water connection has a check valve in here, which I did remove. So we want to make sure that your black tank flush does not have a check valve in there. So the black tank flush is going to have something similar to this. You might call it, or you might hear it referred to as a vacuum breaker, anti-siphon valve. But basically, anytime we're connecting city water, which is, potable, sanitized water, to something like our black tank flush. So this tube on your RV would go out and connect to that flush inside the tank. So theoretically, this side of this system could very well be contaminated with feces, black water, just nasty stuff. So this vacuum breaker or anti-siphon valve is in the system to make sure that this water never back feeds and could potentially get into the city water system. There's not a lot of chance that's going to happen because this is a pressurized system, but worst case scenario, something happened where this pushback, this valve is open, the city water for some reason isn't pressurized. We just want to make sure that none of that unsanitary black water can possibly contaminate the city water system. So this is a requirement anytime we're connecting city water to something that could potentially be hazardous. The way this anti-siphon valve works is there's a little plunger in here that as the water pressure hits the bottom of it, that plunger is going to push up against a seat and allow the water to flow. Theoretically, as soon as we take the pressure off of this side, that plunger is going to drop back down and allow just normal atmospheric pressure, air, into this system so that it can't create a siphon, hence the name anti-siphon valve. So I like to use this particular one to demonstrate how this works because it comes apart really easily. So you can see it's got these slots in here, again, just open to the outside world under normal circumstances. You can see the little plunger that's in there. So this plunger has this rubber seal around the top. So as that water pushes it up, it's going to seat against this surface right here. So it's going to be sitting in there just like that. As soon as the water pressure is released from this side, see if I can do this, that plunger is going to drop down and allow air into this side of the system. So again, breaking any vacuum that may have been created in there. All right, so let me put this back together. Okay, so this is probably more like the anti-siphon valve that you're going to see in your RV. This is really typical for most RVs, just a plastic valve. So let me talk a little bit about this valve. There's actually two parts to this valve. There's this section right here that breaks the siphon, and you can hear that plunger. I call this a plunger sometimes you'll hear this referred to as a float. But basically, again, it's just moving up, sealing so that that water can flow in that direction. That's going to break the siphon, but there's also another important part of this, and you can see down inside of there a spring. So this has a check valve, and what that's going to do is when we apply water pressure, it's going to open that valve and allow water to flow. As soon as we release that pressure, that check valve, the spring in there, is going to push that valve closed. So that's also going to prevent water, if there's any pressure on this side, from pushing back. So typically in an RV, anti-siphon for your black tank flush, that check valve is going to be rated at 8 to 125 psi, which means for it to operate correctly, it needs a minimum of 8 pounds of water pressure. This will open a lot sooner than that. I tested this, well, one similar to this, and with about 2 pounds of pressure, I could get this valve to start. It'll crack, and you'll get a little bit of water coming out of it, but it's designed, like I said, to work between 8 and 125 pounds. That's pretty standard for most of these black tank flush systems. So again, just the anti-siphon valve has the 2 parts. That's really important, because one of the things that building up a little bit of pressure in here to get that valve to open helps to hold this plunger up tight against the seal. So let's say we remove this check valve and I just let the water trickle in here without building up any kind of pressure. I'm never going to get a good seat on this float or this plunger. So having some back pressure is a requirement to keep this thing from leaking. So again, let me just talk about how I have my hose connected. So a lot of us are going to use these Y connectors, you know, at wherever your city water connection is, and then come off of one side with the hose that you're going to use to flush your black water tank, and the other side is going to go to your fresh water. Perfectly fine. I'm isolating things here, and I never want to use the same hose to flush my black tank system that I'm using to put clean water into my RV. So I have the valve set up here. Now normally you're going to have a long hose coming out of each side, but just to make this a little bit simpler to demonstrate, I put my Y connector here. So I have this hose here. This is under pressure, so I can open one side and that would go to my freshwater tank. When I open this side, again, that water is going to come in, push that plunger up, and it's going to allow water to shoot out this tube, which according, you know, theoretically, that's inside my black tank. So when I open it, you should be able to hear this valve open. So under normal circumstances, I'm going to flush my black tank, and then I'm going to disconnect this hose. And so I get this question a lot. Well, whenever I disconnect this hose, I get water running out. Is that coming out of my black tank? Should I be concerned? And the answer is no. What you're seeing here is water coming out of this piece of PEX. So again, we broke our seal here. So this is going to be allowed to drain without creating a siphon. So we're never going to be pulling water, if this is all working properly, from our black tank. So we want this water to drain out. We don't want it to stand in this pipe, because if it does, the water is going to stay right at this level, and as this thing gets heated up during the day, that water is going to expand and it's going to want to trickle out, and it's going to cause a leak. And we don't want this to leak, because this actually sits inside of our RV, and it's going to be the highest point of this whole black tank flush system. So yeah, you can get quite a bit of water draining out of here. So let's talk a little bit about what happens if I leave my hose connected and have this valve closed so that I'm not allowing that water to leave. So let me turn this back on and let me show you, or maybe prove to you, that there is still water standing in here. So that water level is right at the top of this thing. Now, because that plunger and that O-ring on that plunger is what actually creates the seal, with this water standing here right now, there's nothing to keep it from leaking out and draining into my RV. So let me prove my theory here. All right, I'm going to turn this back on just to make sure that that is up to the height it needs to be. Now, that's another thing is, if I never let the water drain out of here, occasionally, you just saw some water come out of there, it's going to leak out. Because under normal circumstances, it's going to start with a column of air that's going to hit that plunger, so it's going to seal before the water gets there. If I leave the water in that tube, I'm going to get occasionally some water leaking out of here. Again, we don't want that to happen because that is inside your RV. So on a warm day, let me grab my heat gun here. On a warm day, let's see if I can drive this up a little bit. The water in this piece of PEX pipe, and if I'm connected, to say a 25-foot black hose that's laying out in the sun, all that water is going to expand as it heats up. So what I'm doing with my heat gun is just demonstrating what's going to happen to this anti-siphon valve as that water heats up. I just saw the first drip. So I'm going to turn this off. All right, so this is warm, but it's by no means hot. And so as that water heats up, so if it's 100 degrees outside and the last time you flushed this, it was in the morning, it was chilly, this water is going to expand enough where it's going to push out of here. So not a lot, but definitely enough to cause you problems. Definitely, if I had a black hose sitting out in the sun, all the water expanding in that hose is going to push a lot more water out of here. So just saw another drip. So it's definitely going to cause a leak. Now, is that leak bad enough to, really concern you? Well, in my case, yes, because of where this anti-siphon valve sits. So let's talk about another issue with leaving your hose connected, especially if you're relying on a little valve like this back at this Y. So we're going to have our fresh water coming in on this side, and because we've got pressure, coming from our spigot, we're relying on this little valve right here, and believe it or not, valves can leak. So again, this plunger in here, we want that to hit with full force to seal at the top to make sure that we don't get water leaking out of here. Well, what if we had a slow leak on this valve? So I'm just going to open it up a little bit. All right, there we go. So if I had just a small leak, and you can see it stopped after a little bit, but I've been able to mess around with this, and I could actually get this thing to constantly run. So yeah, that's going to be a case where you're, walking around your RV and you notice a big puddle of water underneath of it. And when you open up that pass-through or storage bay, there's a couple of inches of water sitting in there. It could very well be because your anti-siphon valve is leaking and you kept it connected to, in some form connected to city water. So my recommendation is absolutely disconnect your hose when you're done flushing your black tank, and then also make sure that you remove the hose and any kind of valve that might be in the system and allow this thing to drain. And so let me just open this back up. And you can see that water has completely drained out. For the system to work properly, it needs to be able to vent here. It already vents to the atmosphere here. So definitely it's important that you disconnect your hose. If you have any kind of valve in line, open that valve up. And yeah, we don't want this thing leaking inside your RV.